afternoon, and thank you all so much for dodging the rain and coming to the York Festival of Ideas. I have to say I have a Pavlovian reaction every time I hear that music, because I hear it so often, and I forget every year, and then I kind of go, oh, that's that music again. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm June Concannon, I'm Director of York Festival of Ideas, and it's an enormous privilege to welcome Josh here today. I think rage definitely is all the rage, and this is going to be a very interesting conversation, and it is an incredibly interesting book. I now have to put my glasses on to tell you a little bit about Josh, because I forgot to bring my big font version, and I'm that age. So Josh Cohen is a psychoanalyst in private practice and was for many years Professor of Modern Literary Theory at Goldsmiths, University of London. He is the author of Not Working, Why We Have to Stop. I have to get that. The Private Life, on Why We Remain in the Dark, and How to Read Freud. I mean, how could you not want to know more about this? As well as other books and articles on psychoanalysis, cultural theory, and modern literature. I mean, if you look at the scale of the laudatory commentary about this book, in terms of how much it has garnered already from the hardback to what I have, which is the paperback, which is on sale downstairs. And Josh, I'm sure, will be very happy to sign books. But I will simply quote this one: a roller coaster of emotion that will take you through rushes of your own most powerful feelings and then deliver you born anew. The most intense and rewarding reward I have ever had. I think we're in for a very interesting hour. So Josh is going to talk for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we will expect you to have lots of questions. Josh, over to you.
Thank you so much. It's really lovely to be up here. Always lovely to be in Yorkshire. And thank you, Joan. I'm not sure how I feel about you reading that blurb. It's a bit of a one to live up to. So I'm just going to start by sketching out a few depressingly relevant stories of recent times. You will remember that 2 years ago, a tidal wave of disinformation spread over the airways and social media, helped along in no small part by the billionaire owner and incontinent poster on the X platform. Together with various cynical pundits and politicians, they sparked riots by falsely reporting that the perpetrator of the stabbings of children at a dance class in Southport had been a Muslim immigrant. He was, in fact, born in Wales to Rwandan parents. This cycle in which disinformation sparks an uncontained rage that then, with grim predictability, explodes on the streets, has repeated itself in the last few weeks. The same cast, led by Elon Musk and Nigel Farage and various hard-right avatars, now repeating itself in the riots following the Henry Novak case. So I found a useful context for thinking about the particular quality of this rage. It comes from the German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk. In Germany, very both revered and controversial, and probably also sometimes hated figure, but I think a brilliant and provocative thinker. And in his 2006 book, Rage and Time, he makes a distinction between two kinds of rage, which I think are incredibly prescient. They get me thinking certainly about the kinds of anger that we're witnessing in our public life today. So there is, if you like, an older-fashioned form of rage, which he calls banked rage. Banked rage is the phenomenon that occurs when anger that is shared by a class or a group is banked, is pulled together, is gathered in one place. against one target, against a particular kind of oppression, which might be racism, which might be economic exploitation, which might be any kind of oppression or discrimination. But this mass anger is pooled to supply a defined cause with a reservoir of emotional and political capital. Right? So you have a pool of rage which supplies, if you like, the cause that and renews its righteousness. Now, to this banked rage, Sloterdijk contrasts another kind of rage, which he calls dispersed rage. Dispersed rage, of course, well, I don't know if you'll think of it as an of course, but to me it's very resonant, this phrase. The sense that we've been seeing, particularly, I think, powerfully over the last decade, that there is a pervasive sense of wrong, which actually seems to traverse different political camps, different groupings, different demographics. One obvious symptom of it is the way that so many voters for Bernie Sanders switched directly, without mediation through anyone in the middle, to Trump. The same thing, of course, is happening now in the so-called red wall seats, where his generations of historic cast iron Labour voters crossed over to Reform, again, without any mediation by the political forces in the middle. So there is a sense of wrong, but a lack of any shared sense of what the wrong is, or of how to put it right. My thesis around this in the book is that dispersed rage is dangerous. It's dangerous because it's a kind of floating resource that can be captured by the highest bidder. And the highest bidder tends to be populist agitators, those actors in the public sphere that give you a very quick and easy remedy and diagnosis for what is ailing people. So populist agitators tend not to identify concrete injustices in the name of putting it right. They tend to find sources of rage and stoke them, sources of rage for which no relief can be found. And this creates a certain kind of public emotional atmosphere, an atmosphere of what I would call mass enervation or mass agitation, a permanent mass agitation, or at least a seemingly permanent one. The purpose, that is not to enlist people in a program for social or political transformation, but to keep people in a state of permanent resentment. And that resentment becomes a kind of political resource that keeps on giving. So in a sense, when we say that the policy platforms of a lot of demagogic right-wing, maybe left-wing as well, platforms, when we say that those policy platforms are incoherent, it's often the case that we're missing the point, that in fact the incoherence is part of the design. Without a distinct diagnosis and remedy, you stoke the same resentment that keeps providing the same energy, the same kind of agitated energy to the movement. So this, I'm suggesting, has been the defining mood of our time. It tends to be these days a bit of a throat-clearing exercise to invoke the year 2016, but it's very difficult not to. 2016 seems to be the beginning of an era of what feels like a pervasive atmosphere of division, of fear, of mutual suspicion and accusation. Now, for a long time, I straddled the academic and clinical worlds. I trained as a psychoanalyst, qualified about nearly 17 years ago. And for a long time, I was sort of shuttling between the two of them. And a couple of years ago, I left the academy and now work permanently in the consulting room. And what I've found in the consulting room as a psychoanalyst is that this public anger seeps insidiously into the texture of private and everyday life. We're all familiar with some of the symptoms of everyday rage, road rage, the ways in which trivial disputes can be escalated at frightening speed on the street, online, sometimes in some slightly alarming hybrid of the two. Political divisions are insinuating themselves into families, friendships, couples, and communities. And these experiences of division and anger find their way into the consulting room. And I suppose one of my experiences doing psychoanalysis and psychotherapy over the last decade has been to notice really how much thinner the wall has become between the inside and the outside of the room. That people, I think, when I started, would only refer to the outside world, to the public world, in passing as a kind of background note, and then they would keep the focus on their personal experience. It's not that they don't do that now, it's just that various kinds of political or social experience seem to be much more prominent in the way that they understand themselves personally. And that can be wherever they're coming from politically. So, that's a kind of sketch of the broad ambient sense of our moment. I want to just introduce a basic distinction that I use in my book, All the Rage. The distinction is between two very common words, aggression and anger. It's very difficult, I think, to make much sense of anger as a psychic and as a cultural phenomenon without making this distinction. So, what is aggression? Aggression is what I think of as a stimulus response. When we leap to an aggressive act, which might be shouting, it might be punching someone, it might be insulting them, but it's, if you like, a bid to do external harm to somebody of some kind, whether it's hurting their feelings or it's hurting their bodies. What you are doing when you aggress somebody is you're essentially bypassing how you feel. It looks like you're being driven by how you feel, but actually you're not staying with your feeling, because staying with the feeling is kind of unbearable. So you want to discharge the feeling, and the way to do that is in action. You punch somebody, and at least you imagine you're going to, as the phrase has it, let off the steam. You're going to get the feeling out of you. So that discharge in action, that's aggression. Anger is different because it's a feeling. We often confuse the two, but it's very important to distinguish them. A feeling, neurologically speaking, right, I'm thinking of the work here of the American neurologist Antonio Damasio. It's a kind of internal mapping of our internal reactive responses. So that there is something going on at a kind of psychic and bodily level that says, I'm feeling this wave of intense agitation. What is it that's happening? Right? And our entire kind of somatic and psychic system replies, I am angry. So feeling anger is a kind of achievement, a kind of developmental achievement. Because what you're doing is you're turning behavioral reaction into something more internal. This is basically also Darwin's point in his book on the expression of emotion. Darwin points out, I mean, he does this with all emotional states, but about anger, he points out that in anger, our musculature clenches, our skin goes either red or white, we develop a kind of biting expression in the mouth. We narrow our eyes, we sweat, etc. And he says this, in fact, is a kind of fossil. It's a fossil that is left behind in the human being from the predatory stance of the hunter. Right? We take up, when we're angry, the stance of the hunter, but we lose, if you like, the context. We're no longer about to actually predate somebody. We're no longer going to leap on them or bite them. We're just in that stance. So it's a fossil of the predatory stance. So feeling anger is something like what we do with our feeling of injury or humiliation when we're not just acting on it. So we tend to think of anger and aggression as a kind of couple, right? They go together, we could say, following the great thinker Frank Sinatra, like a horse and carriage. But anger, on that view, works as a kind of spur or kind of cheerleader to aggression. It sharpens our sense of clarity and righteousness as we launch a physical attack or a street protest or a marital row. Anger sort of is the fuel for our aggressive action. That's one version. But in fact, it's just as, if not more common, for anger and aggression to be in a much more uneasy relationship to each other, for them to uncouple. They don't necessarily go together like a horse and carriage. Anger is uncoupled from aggression in us all the time. That is, how often on any day, many times during that day probably, will we feel angry but have no immediate outlet for that feeling? Right? I suppose the paradigm instance here would be stubbing your toe. Right? An absolutely enraging event, but what are you going to do about it? When we say something like, I'm so angry I don't know what to do with myself, we're, I think, saying more than we know. We have very powerful energies coursing through ourselves, and we want to channel them into some kind of action that would be adequate to the feeling, that would make us feel, I know what to do now with this. And not knowing what to do with yourself is that same agitated state, that enervation that makes us feel lost to ourselves in a way that can feel desperate. That's the atmosphere I was trying to describe before on a wider scale in our political life. So, what are the different things that can happen to anger when it no longer is able to just realize itself immediately in some aggressive action. Well, of course, the most obvious example is what we would call suppression. Now, suppression is when we consciously try to tamp down our feelings of anger, right? We grit our teeth, we perhaps speak with exaggerated politeness or exaggerated friendliness, and we just sort of, but you can sort of see it in somebody who's angry and trying not to be. You see that their breathing's a bit irregular, their speech patterns are a bit broken up, their facial expressions are a little bit at odds with what they're trying to say. So that is suppression, which kind of goes hand in hand with something else we might do, which is covering over aggression with some other attitude like politeness or over-friendliness or even moroseness. These are all ways, moods that we might that might come over us in order to disguise our anger. We might do this consciously, but we might also do this more unconsciously without really being aware of what we're doing. And that takes us more into the territory I find myself in often in the consulting room, which is cutting ourselves off to the point where we have very little or even no idea that we're angry. Clinical experience shows us all the time that people can go through their lives only very dimly aware of an anger that they've been nursing secretly below the radar of their consciousness. In the book, I talk about four cases of angry people. But the second case is a youngish woman I call Olive, who comes suffering various somatic symptoms, aches and pains through the body and terrible headaches. And we discover that she is somebody who is completely alienated from an anger which, if she allowed herself to get in touch with it, she believes would completely unravel her. This is an unconscious belief because she's not even been aware when she comes of how angry she is and spends many, many months denying she's angry at all. Not in an angry way, because she's not angry, but instead in a very sort of confused way. I don't know what you're talking about. So there's a kind of, I would say, quite impoverished discourse around anger. The cultural channels in which it's talked about are very narrow, they're very constraining. I'm thinking in particular of the sort of the dominant ways in which we talk about addressing anger. In particular, that great phrase, anger management, which I think is more often than not in sort of the practice of anger management, it's linked to what we call positive thinking. The difficulty, I think, with anger management, which certainly has its uses, I'm not going to sort of completely trash it. People have found anger management techniques useful, at least as a kind of expedient to help them deal in a kind of moment-to-moment way with their anger. You know, all the hacks, bashing pillows, counting to 10, taking deep breaths. These can be, on a temporary basis, quite helpful. But I think from a more global perspective, the difficulty is that they treat anger as a problem that needs solving, rather than actually a substantive region of our inner lives, of our identities. In other words, anger is something we shouldn't be, which means that we're always at odds with ourselves, because angry is something we all often are. So if we shouldn't be what we often are, what are we supposed to do with that? In a wonderful polemical book, the late writer and journalist Barbara Ehrenreich, a book she wrote called Smile or Die. Smile or Die is about what she calls a sort of the reign of terror, really, of positive thinking. She starts by talking about her own cancer diagnosis and how the emotional management of her cancer was very much focused on thinking positively, which meant, presumably, that all fear, all sadness, all anxiety had to be suppressed or expelled because it wasn't useful, it wasn't helpful. She quotes the kinds of inspirational, motivational gurus who enjoin us to, as she quotes, get rid of the negative people in your life. So positive thinking treats negative feelings, so-called negative feelings, anger, sadness, as a kind of foreign body, an intrusive sort of usurper that's taken over us and that we need to expel. So anger becomes a problem, I would say, the moment we have to do something with it other than just be angry, as in act on it, discharge it. Let's take one of the most pervasive and profound and intractable sources of public anger today, particularly among the younger generation, although certainly not exclusively so, which is ecological anger. How do we mobilize anger against fossil fuel extraction, against the heating and inexorable destruction of this planet? No doubt many of us in this room feel angry about this. But our predicament is that we lack a single party, or as Sloterdijk would put it, we lack a bank in which to focus and pool our anger. For many of us, our protests and actions, like our efforts to change our behaviour, are scattered and confused and anxious and inconsistent. The aim of the climate justice movement, which would be, I suppose, to keep global heating to the lowest level possible, requires the intricate coordination of multiple aims. It implicates nothing less than the global population in action both with and against their own nations. It requires the cooperation of international scientific and political organizations, of agricultural and transport and energy corporations, and financial institutions. We are describing, in other words, not so much an object as what the philosopher Timothy Morton calls a hyperobject. A hyperobject being an entity that is so multi-layered, that is so multifaceted, that is so sublimely colossal, that it becomes very difficult to map it. So the object of climate anger is radically diffuse because it's scattered everywhere and nowhere, involving forces which implicate all of us, especially in the global north, even as we protest against them. I find talking to young people, especially my own children, that anger about this can often take the form of a kind of melancholic despair, a sense of furious impotence. It's very hard, I think, to infuse climate anger with positive thinking. Although this might be something that you want to take up in the questions, because I do think it's particularly, it's one of, in a way, the great political and ethical difficulties of our time. How is it that we manage the psychic burden of our anger about this issue? Climate anger, I think, is a prime instance of anger as what we might call unusable. So, in the last part of this talk, I just want to ask what it would mean for rage to be usable. The last chapter in the book is called Usable Rage. And I find a kind of pathway to this initially, perhaps a bit surprisingly, through the framing story of the 1001 Nights, the story of Scheherazade. So you may know the story, but I will recall it for you just in case you've forgotten any elements. Shahryar, the emperor of Persia, the young emperor, has undertaken a sort of psychopathic killing spree of young brides. He's discovered that his first bride was untrue to him. And in order to take out his rage on womankind, he takes brides for one night and then he executes them in the morning. And this starts to become a serious crisis because calls are being put out for more brides, but brides are getting a little bit more reluctant to put themselves forward for this privilege. The daughter of one of Shah Jahan's satraps, a young woman called Scheherazade, comes along and volunteers, and her dad says, "Are you crazy? I mean, do you know what this guy does?" She says, "Well, give me a chance." And on their wedding night, she sits up and she says to him, "I'll tell you what, I'm going to tell you a story." And she tells the first of the 1001 stories that make up this book. And the story spins out, and Shah Jahan finds himself completely absorbed by the story. And she leaves it on a cliffhanger, and they have to get up because it's morning. And she says, he says, "Tell me the ending." She says, no, it's morning, we have to get up. So I guess you'll have to behead me now, unless you want to wait for the resolution of the story the next night. He says, yes, okay, we'll postpone the execution. And the same thing happens the next night, and, well, you get the idea, right? It happens again and again and again. And at the end of this, the misogynistic killing spree is forgotten, and Scheherazade has borne Shah Jahan, I think, 4 children, and instead of beheading her, he makes her his queen. What a nice guy. So we can think about these two characters in terms of, or at least I do, in terms of what psychoanalysis thinks of two different kinds of energy. Shah Jahan represents an energy that psychoanalysis calls aggressive energy. And aggressive energy is about foreclosing. It's about shutting down. It's about sort of murderously defensive stance. You don't want to, in other words, acknowledge your vulnerability, as he does when he's betrayed. So instead, you harden yourself and you kill the person who's betrayed you. what you're always doing here is you're shutting out other feeling options. You're reduced to one tedious, vicious monotone of violence. Now, Scheherazade, on the other hand, represents libidinal energy, which we normally associate with the sexual or the erotic, but really it also refers to a kind of openness and curiosity towards the world. And that's what she tries to infuse her new groom with. She says to him, night after night, look, you can shut things down with an outburst of aggressive energy, or you can open yourself to other experiences. And of course, these are stories that are taken from all around the world. So what she's really doing is she's opening him up to the possibility of other experiences, other ways of feeling, other voices. And that curiosity, in the end, ends up triumphing over the kind of closed aggressive. So, do you want to remain in murderous rigidity or open up to the world and to others? I'm going to close in a moment, but there is a wonderful quotation from James Baldwin in his essay, The Fire Next Time. He's writing about what he understands as this sort of the closed, rigid emotional life of too many American white people. And he gives this example. He says, white people tend to think that happy songs are happy, and he does happy in italics. Happy songs are happy, and sad songs are sad. Again, sad in italics. What's he saying? He's saying that when people are in a state of rigid defense, they hive emotions off, they hive feelings off from one another. They don't listen to the sense in which they're neighbouring emotions, the ways in which they fold into one another. So I want to read a very, very brief bit from very near the end of the book. Aggressive anger depersonalizes the self. Verbal and physical acts of aggression tend to turn the person who performs them into an interchangeable instance of a generalized feeling. When I yell pointlessly through my windscreen at a driver who's just cut me up with a reckless right turn, I'm secretly and unhappily aware that I'd rather hide behind this comical stock figure of a middle-aged road rager than endure the momentary feeling of humiliation hovering unwanted at the edges of my consciousness. If I didn't default so quickly to yelling, in other words, I might be forced to feel something other, something more than a reflexive anger. Lurking beneath that reflex would be perhaps feelings of impotence and anxiety, some resentment and even envy at how readily available such aggression is to other, especially younger male drivers. In contrast to the distance and unease I feel in relation to my own aggression, not to mention the sadness I feel at no longer being young. There is, I'm suggesting, a rich but disavowed personal history of feeling that's concealed even beneath the trivial, unseen event of my yelling at a person who can't hear me. How transformative might it be for relations between people if those depths could be sounded and heard and received? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I must say I recognised an element of myself. My husband always depicts that when I am angry, my first instinct is to suppress it, and he describes it as akin to hissing like a goose. So I certainly felt, although I wish he were here for the road rage analogy.
Yes.
So let me ask a kind of a starter question on the. I always think about when you're thinking about people en masse, and we know that there's lots of discussion about the public realm being broken and the anger of people. But it felt to me that in that dispersed anger cohort, there is a cohort who are sort of there but not there, who are manipulating the dispersal of that anger. But do you think, I mean, let's face it, we know you mentioned Musk as one particular player. Do you think they're angry as well, and what are they angry about? I mean, they have so much already.
Yes. I think again, the Persian emperor is quite a nice analogy, I think, to Musk, and to the other sort of elite stokers of this dispersed rage. What they seem to be is resentful at the idea that anyone might challenge their entitlement to say how things should be. There is, I think you see this in Musk all the time. He sort of takes these bizarre, extreme fringe positions, but he infuses his pronouncements with a kind of dead-eyed certainty that I think is trying to naturalize them, trying to make them seem not only as though they're reasonable, but as though they're given truths. One word that he always uses when people make very extreme comments on his platform is true. He'll just say true. And often it's in response to some wildly conspiratorial and more often than not kind of brutally racist remark. So there is a certain kind of player that's come onto the world stage that I think feels that anchoring and therefore limiting their discourse and their freedom to act by appealing to certain aspects of facts or of reality is a kind of, it's an unnecessary and unjust tethering of their freedom. And so what they're really trying to do is do away with reality. And it's reality, I think, that they're angry with. That, I think, is the difference from the people whose anger, the sort of ordinary people whose anger they're trying to enlist.
I could ask questions all day, but this is your floor and your show. So we've got about 15 to 20 minutes of questions. And excellent. Lady first out of the traps here. Just wait for the microphone because there might be some people on a hearing loop.
Hello. Is that right?
Yes.
As a psychoanalyst, how would you differentiate anger or rage from hate?
Yeah.
That's really
That's a great question. They often overlap, but I do think it's important to separate them simply because, of course, we can. I'm going to come at this from a slightly different tack because I want to go back to what I was trying to say at the end about the neighbourliness of emotions, the ways in which it's very difficult to mark them off rigidly and clearly from one another. One of, I suppose, what the great teachings of psychoanalysis is what is in the jargon called ambivalence, but really the proximity of hate to love. That every love, even the deepest, perhaps especially the deepest, contains elements of hate. And that hate itself is complicated because it's not often personal hate. Often the hate has to do with the fact that the person you love makes you needy and vulnerable. And that's a state that none of us really like to be too much in contact with. When there's a kind of healthy aliveness to currents of love and hate. Our anger, I think, can be expressed in that feeling way, in that way that I think can actually be received by the other person. When it gets split off, when you are trapped inside a feeling of hatred that has lost any kind of contact with other feelings like compassion or love, then the anger itself also becomes overwhelming to the person and therefore to the object of the anger as well. So anger can be quite loving. It can be compassionate. It can be infused with all kinds of I mean, this was really something that Baldwin was always trying to say about his own anger, about the anger of African Americans, that it is infused with a love that is never acknowledged. That in a way it's caricatured as being sort of a blind hatred. When it becomes a blind hatred, it becomes not only violent, but as we see in the 1001 Nights story, it becomes tedious and boring. That the hating person, again, Musk is, I think, a really good example. They just stop saying anything very interesting after a while.
Next, oh, goodness me. You've caught my eye first, a man in the t-shirt.
A word that you haven't mentioned is hope, which seems to me to be, I guess, the antidote to dispersed anger. Would you like to comment on that? And I mean, just for openness, I'm chair of York Green Party, and we're saying make hope normal again. So that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, great. Okay, no, that's really useful. Yes, hope, I think, as a kind of different entity than optimism. I think one can be hopeful without being sort of blindly positive or optimistic. And I think hope actually comes from having not a kind of, it's not optimism. It doesn't come from an unrealistic extraction of everything that's difficult from the vista in front of you. In fact, you have to have everything that's difficult right in front of you. You have to be alive to what's difficult. And then hope, I think, for me, it's very much connected to that stance of kind of openness to a range of feelings, a range of voices, a range of experiences, which might include despair, which might include horror, I mean, particularly in the green context, which might include rage, as well as, joy, moral energy. I think hope is the capacity to move flexibly between those states, something like that.
Okay, lady here in front.
I just wanted to comment that what's happening at the moment is inducing terror. It's the flip side of the coin, and both Trump and Musk seem unable to imagine anything other than their own perspective.
Yeah.
And that filters through. And I speak as a chair of an organisation in Stockton-on-Tees, a mental health organisation for refugees. And we're scared of the building being attacked, of the blind rage that in some ways I understand in a deprived area such as that.
Yeah.
But there seems to be no middle ground developing.
Yeah. I that resonates so powerfully for me. And I do think it speaks to the panacea the kind of the false panacea that is being peddled by these demagogues, which is that if you can be sure and righteous in your rage, you will also be relieved of it, or you will be comforted. Everything will be good if you just burn down that, that refugee center. It's also, it's profoundly pernicious, of course, to the victims of the violence that then gets stoked, but also it's pernicious to the perpetrators of it, because they never find, they're not going to find relief at the bottom of those kinds of acts.
Right, there's a lady down this side, because we haven't taken any questions very much from here.
Just thinking about some of the things you said and the clinical kind of setting that you worked in, do you think that there's something to be said for like incorporating an understanding like this of anger into like broader like healthcare and like mental health care as well, given that it seems to bring on like psychosomatic and like more physical problems as well? And if you were going to do that, how would you ideally like to go about that, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question.
And I wonder about education
in
that context to add to your pillars.
Yes, indeed. I think one of the difficulties in mental health is that the more that we try to increase accessibility into it, the less resources we can give to each individual, or at least that's the calculus that we're told is given. And so when you have very short cognitive-based behavioral therapies, 6 sessions, 8 sessions, maybe 10 sessions, it's, I think, very difficult to do more than offer people behavioral hacks. It's very difficult to get them to think about the sources of their anger, which of course not just in their personal history, but in the world beyond, which again is kind of another change that I'm kind of really alive to in my own clinical practice, that I'm not just, that it's not just that it's one or the other, it's that the two really bleed into each other, that so often people are bringing personal histories whose pains or traumas are infused with things that are happening in the broader world, particularly young people. So I would love to see the financing of something that happened in the 30s and 40s in Central Europe, which is the setting up of systems of free clinics, which provide longer term psychotherapy at very low rates. I think that there would be ways of doing that. There are examples in London. For example, the Camden Psychotherapy Unit, where you can have 2 years of regular psychotherapy at almost at nominal rates. So yes, I would put out an advert for that, and I would also want to introduce a much kind of deeper level of emotional education into the curriculum.
Mm-hmm. I think I did spot you earlier, and then I thought I'd missaw. It's fine. Wait for the mic because there might be someone on a loop.
Thank you very much. So if as human beings we're iterative loops, and a huge core of our cognition is relating to analogy, where are we going to find these good examples for really utilising our rage effectively?
Yes. Yeah, that's... I'm not sure about modelling or examples, actually. I mean, we can point to people that we admire, to activists, to thinkers, who have tried to teach us. You know, we could think about Baldwin or Audre Lorde or Mahatma Gandhi, people who have tried to teach us in a way how to craft our rage, how to channel it into creative, rich, experiential projects. But it's not, I guess what I'm saying is we don't want a kind of imitative program, be like this person or be, I think it's a kind of richer project to get people into dialogue with figures that they admire and try to imagine what their project would mean in their own moment, in their own context, addressing the kinds of injustice that they're facing today. So a kind of creative adaptation of previous models rather than an imitation, I suppose I want to say.
Can I ask a codicil to that? It was a very interesting conference I went to on public trust just before Christmas, and one of the speakers from American higher education was endorsing the idea of reaching out to those who you know hate you or that you have some dubious viewpoints about as well. His observation, which has stuck with me ever since, is it's much harder to hate somebody if you're closer to them. And I wondered how that fits in that kind of panoply of everything that you've talked about.
Yeah. I think that is right. And I think proximity is important because I'm talking about the proximity of neighbouring emotions. And what we do when we're physically distant and socially distant from other kinds of group is the same kind of division, almost in parallel, occurs within us. I don't need to consider them. I can block off what they mean or what their lives are for them. They are something other. And so division is something, I think, iterative. I think it is something that is recapitulated at many different layers, from the personal to, the highest levels of social life. So what you're doing when you meet another person is you're actually being forced to bring your hostility or your hate into contact with something else, with, good humor or something ordinary, even trivial, that might be shared that immediately breaks something down. You support the same football team, you like the same chocolate bar.
So we're almost at time, but let me ask one final practical question. I was really intrigued by the story of Olive and started to look around the room and thought, how many of it is, how do we recognise, or are there ways for us to recognise the nuance of the idea that we are actually suppressing rage to such a degree that we don't recognise it and it manifests itself?
Yeah.
What are the things that we should be looking out for?
Well, the lady at the back mentioned, the somatic symptoms, and I think those really are the first. And again, I think the level of, maybe things are getting a bit better. People do recognise the relationship between somatic and psychic disorders, but still, I was amazed. About 5 or 6 years ago, a woman came to me and she'd been having terrible headaches. And I said something about, how they might be rooted, this first meeting, how they might be rooted in emotional distress. And she said, what have headaches got to do with emotional distress? Now, at one level, of course, she wouldn't have been there if she didn't understand that there was a relationship. But at the same time, there was something in her that really didn't want to know about that. So these ideas of the relationship between the somatic and the psychological, they can sort of circulate, and yet they can also be denied and kind of taken for granted to the extent that you don't really take them seriously, you don't internalize them. They're just sort of, they're mantras in a way. So I think listening to your body, I think that's your first signal of whether in fact all kinds of layers of angers are accumulating in you, affecting your behavior, your relationship to yourself, your relationships with others in ways you might not.
Josh, thank you so much. That has been absolutely fascinating. The book is for sale downstairs. I think it's the paperback one. And I'm sure Josh would be happy to chat to you as he signs lots of books. I should say, and I certainly feel even more certain in my thinking about this, tomorrow we've got a whole focus day putting democracy on trial. And I think the manifestation of some of what we've been talking about today about public rage in the kind of public realm will certainly be interrogated in real time tomorrow. And we have somebody called Dex Hunter-Torek who has worked with a number of big tech bros and has come to the realization that the positioning that he worked on around the idea of big technology as benevolent is not necessarily his reflection. And so he's kicking off a day exploring the intersection between democratic accountability, technology power, and ungovernability, with, going back to your point, where do we find the hope? And so if you haven't already signed up and you're interested in these topics and the interrelationship between the personal and the political, I invite you all to come along tomorrow as well. But for now, I just want to say an enormous thank you to Josh, who's travelled up here today. It's a bit chaotic around the train station. That might be the understatement of the century, but we'll get there. And to thank you so much for such an interesting, thoughtful, I will never think about Scheherazade in quite the same way again. Thank you so much for such a fascinating talk, and thank you to all of you for such brilliant questions. Yes. And we will meet downstairs at the bookstall with our brilliant independent booksellers, Fox Lane Books. Thank you again.